I'm not a narrative practitioner, and some of your customs are strange to me, and some of your language is strange to me. And I also think there are many things that we've been able to garner and learn from narrative practice for the kinds of organizing work that I do. And I'm going to be speaking, just for clarity's sake, mostly from a community organizing perspective, and about work that some of is past and I'm not doing anymore, and some is kind of carrying forward to the future. And I'm also going to be speaking about the United States because that's the context that I work in, and hopefully some of that stuff will be applicable to your context as well if that's not where you're from. I'm going to be speaking about work that I've done to intervene in interpersonal harm as well as to end the violence of imprisonment and the violence of policing. And I'm going to try not to do this, but you may hear me say prison industrial complex, which is, when I'm talking about that, I'm just really talking about the intersection of public and private interests that use imprisonment, policing, surveillance, sentencing, and their cultural, kind of the attendant cultural systems as remedies for what I think are really social, political, economic problems. So if you hear me say that, that's what I'm getting at there. I might also use the criminal legal system, but I'll try to be precise in my language rather than general. I work on these issues broadly, but I also think it's important to represent my orientation toward the work, which is that of Black self-determination and liberation. So my work around imprisonment and policing in particular is really guided by a value and an ethic around the liberation of Black people in the United States. And I do think truly that that's one of the surest ways to ensure our liberation is to eliminate the use of imprisonment and policing. I'll be talking about Critical Resistance, which is an organization that I helped to found. That's a national grassroots organization in the United States that was established to do campaigns and projects in different parts of the country, really with the aim of eliminating the use of imprisonment, policing, surveillance, and sentencing, and simultaneously trying to figure out how to deal with harm and how to deal with inequity and how to build healthy, sustainable, well communities. I'll also talk a little bit about creative interventions and its kind of daughter project, the Storytelling and Organizing Project. Creative Interventions is a community resource center that was developed to experiment with different ways that we could intervene in interpersonal harm without relying on imprisonment, policing, or traditional social services that tend to be kind of bound up with imprisonment and policing. And the Storytelling and Organizing Project was the kind of public face of the organization through which people could tell stories of the kinds of things that they did all day, every day, to intervene in situations of harm without relying on imprisonment and policing. And I think some of you have seen documents or websites or similar things from those two organizations, and I know it's in your optional reading, so you can always go back should you be interested. And you can continue to ignore it should you not be after you hear me speak. Okay, so the first thing that I would like to do today is to share a clip from the Storytelling and Organizing Project. And it's a piece that we developed at STOP. That's what that is, Storytelling and Organizing Project, so STOP. And I want to say a few things about it. First of all, the project takes much longer conversations that we had with people about different strategies that they had tried, stories that they wanted to tell, about times that they had intervened in interpersonal harm. And then we kind of condensed them down into more manageable public chunks that get shared via the website. And the idea is that we're building and contributing to collectively a shared set of knowledge about preventing, interrupting, and eliminating harm. And that the act of receiving the stories can help people innovate in terms of what they think they might do under those circumstances, to generate confidence, to know that people actually do that. And so when you're told by a social worker, no disrespect, or you're told by law enforcement that you need to be a professional to intervene in these kinds of things, you know that people actually are doing this, right? And to be part of a collective body that shares in these strategies. So the idea is that you could hear those, you could innovate, you could share your own story, or that you could apply lessons that you've learned in your own life. And so what we do is we share these stories. And I'm going to actually share a story, a piece of a story that Isaac shared, who's in the room. And yeah, that's awkward. It's awkward to hear your own story projected, right? So let's just acknowledge that. But it's a story that Isaac shared about a situation that he was asked to help intervene in, and he ultimately sought some support from Creative Intervention, where he and I were both working at the time. And I want to provide a little bit of background because he starts kind of in mid-story, and so I want to provide a bit of background so you have a sense of what he was responding to. So in Oakland, California, where Isaac and I live, and that's near San Francisco, for those of you who know U.S. geography. At the time when this situation was unfolding, it was 2009, correct, Isaac? There had just been a very high-profile police murder of a young black man named Oscar Grant III. He had been killed by a transit cop. He'd been laid face down on the ground and shot in the back while there was a police officer on top of him. And in addition, this action happened in front of a stopped train. So hundreds of transit riders saw this, captured still images and video images on their telephones, and immediately sent that all over the world. So again, this is 2009. This is 3 years before Trayvon Martin is killed, so you might recognize that name. It's 5 years before Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. You might recognize that name. But it had a very similar impact on the local community, and there were weeks of protest. And the first days after he was killed, Oscar Grant was killed, there were nightly protests that were very large and very intense, and resulted in confrontation with law enforcement, and over 100 people, 100 protesters were arrested during those first nights. A friend of Isaac's had contacted him during these days after the shooting because a mutual acquaintance had a gun, and he was out on the street in public. He was threatening to harm himself, and he had been threatening to harm himself in front of his partner, who was completely distraught and did not know what to do, was at a loss. This person is also a political activist who had a known history to some of his friends of having some mental health challenges. He was a person who identifies as queer, identifies as a person of color, and who had already had confrontations with police. And there was some concern among his friend that he might attempt what some people call suicide by cop, in which he would force a confrontation that may result in them killing him. Some of the people in the community, in his broader community, also knew that he was slated to be fired from his job the coming week. He did not yet know that was going to happen. So that's some of the context, and I think it's important context to understand, because what we asked Isaac to share in this clip are really some strategies in the orientation rather than the plot of what happened. I also want to say that before I play the story, that we always try to say before we share these clips that there can be things in them that might raise memories or might evoke emotions or might be difficult to hear. And so I always want to provide people an opportunity to leave the room or to get up and leave should anything happen. It's about 6 minutes long, this clip I'm going to play you. And we'll take a pause after.
It just wasn't an option. It just was, on multiple levels. The police are like, the enemy. So it's like, just don't call the cops. Now, like, what's inside of that, I don't think it's just like a theoretical political thing. There's the fact that the police had just shot this person in front of hundreds of people, videotape rolling. they had just been incredibly violent out on the street. There was like a police state in downtown. Like on every level, calling the cops was not an option, right? So there's the political level in which it's like, you don't call the oppressor to help you out. You just don't. Then there's the level of our politics being like, we need to like figure out ways to deal with this shit that aren't about calling in the source of violence, right? So then there's all kind of layers that happen with that, because then there's like, well, why don't we, right? And in this situation, why don't we? Here is this person who is distraught, who has a gun, who's a person of color. There's no fucking way we could trust the cops to do anything but, I mean, what were the cops going to do at best? The most safe thing that they would possibly do would be to physically disarm this person, which would involve, violence, right? And lock them up. That is like the best case scenario. So it addresses none of the problem, right? Like at all. It was about this person's safety, but in a way that was not just responding to a crisis around their safety, but also like, what can we do? So it's not just what can we do by any means necessary to stop this self-harm or harm to another person, but like, how is what we're going to do right now going to reverberate to helping this person move through the period in their lives that is happening, unfolding, right, in this very acute way, right in this moment. I mean, I guess that's actually kind of hopeful that even in those moments of crisis that you are actually thinking about that. Incorporated into why the moment is serious is also like the future. You're never told in a moment, you might be told in all these other ways in life, right, about de-escalating violent situations. So it's like, oh, you have a beef with your neighbor that's getting kind of heated. Well, just try to talk it out, or you could hire a mediator, or call a lawyer, and then other ways, right? Like these are like interpersonal things. But very rarely is it ends. The discourse ends, I think, when there's a gun involved or an act of violence. Oh, well, then you call the police. And it's almost like it's like a natural thing, right? It's like, that's not even like, you call the police because it's like, and then it starts raining. It's like, then you call the police. It's like an act of nature. And so we don't call the police, we call this community organization. And I think that is like pretty, it's cool. I mean, it's cool that it existed. It's cool that we knew about it. It's cool that we did. But I think also what's cool is that that's where our mind went very quickly in this crisis moment. And so, I don't know, just once again, it engenders a little bit of hope, around like our abilities to respond when the resources are so scarce, right? And we started talking about what we had done, and we started talking about like, what could we do? And where was the harm, right? What were the different levels of harm, right? And where are our efforts, where are our loyalties, where are we invested, where are we in relationship to all this stuff, what are our priorities? And we talked about that, and that was really good. And I think that's what became the center was, okay, so there's this thing that's going to happen next week, and it is potentially traumatic to this person, and he has acted out in this way previously. His mode of acting out has intensified, so the harm or the potential harm has intensified, the harm to himself and therefore the potential harm to others has intensified. So what can we do to reduce the harm? And so we started talking about everything that we can do. And so like one of the major things we talked about is like, who else can we involve? And that's where it came up to where it was like, let's try to map out who else can help here. And the help being specific to what's the most like urgent things, right? And what we're trying to learn from these things, right? It's like, where are people's people in these situations, right? And the analogy that was like, You know, it's like if we were all trying to lift something that was really heavy. It's a lot easier to lift something that's really heavy if you have more than two people doing it, you know? And especially if it's something heavy that y'all care about, and y'all carrying it is in relationship to you caring about it, and it affects how you care about it down the, you know, and it's just like, so it's like true. It's like, where are these people's people, you know?
What I would invite you to do right now is to talk to each other about what you heard before I continue speaking. So I know you've been doing lots of pairs. What if we do like 3 or 4 people talking to each other? And I'd just like you to reflect on what you've heard. So let's talk. Who has something on their mind? And I want you to know that I have asked Isaac if it's okay if you also ask him questions, and he has graciously agreed. So he's done work on STOP, and he has done work with critical resistance as well.
Isaac, in that clip, third paragraph, you said the discourse ends, I think, when there's a gun involved. In our discussions here, we've been talking about different contexts where guns aren't as present, and I'm wondering from in your actions if you're able to have that discourse about gun control, and if that's part of something that could be helpful in your communities.
I think all of us that were involved in that intervention, I'm trying to think back, it was a little while back now, but I think all of us involved in that politically believed in the right of oppressed people to armed self-defense. So we did not have an issue with the ownership, this person owning weapons. Our issue was, and also as I think about it, his ownership of weapons was not because he was like a right-wing gun collector or, he had some politics, and there's a tradition in the United States of oppressed people being able to defend themselves. And so I would say he came out of that politics. So I think there was an engagement with that politics. And I actually think that helped, because it helped to demystify the weaponry a little bit, I would think, because we were able to have more rational conversations about what his options were that weren't over-determined by the fact that there was a gun. And I guess that cuts both ways, that perhaps we're like jaded in the United States. Oh, yeah, he has a gun. Everybody has guns. So maybe that cuts both ways. But that was the extent, and I think one of the ways the story played out, I don't want to get too caught up in the details of the story, but was that we were able to have him give up his weapons. We were able to take them from him, but him to voluntarily hand them over to us for safekeeping until he was able to get into a place that was a better place emotionally and mental health-wise, and then we gave them back. And we all agreed that was a principle, that was the right thing to do. So I guess that was some community gun control.
Mm. Yeah.
Lauren and I live in countries that guns are not readily available, and it made us think about something we haven't had cause to think about, and hope we never do. But was how does one respond to a person who is in distress but is carrying a gun and may have the intention of having himself assassinated? And it made us think about things we've never thought about before, and which would be a very different kind of response requiring collective courage. Yeah. Because you really know in this situation that you are putting your life at risk. And so that was something that made us think more than we have had to in our countries where guns are far, less commonplace.
Yeah, so thank you so much for your reflections. And, in particular, the last thing that you raised, David, I think, comes out in the story, too, right? It's like we think we can respond to all manner of things, but add a gun, add heightened lethality, and we want to back off, right? And we've been instructed and socialized that we should not intervene in those situations. And I think to take the very real threat of harm in intervening in those situations seriously is important. And there's also an ethic that we can build around community response that doesn't put you individually at the face of a barrel of a gun in the same way and gives you a broader range of options. And so I think in some ways that's precisely what this clip and this story is meant to bring out. I want to talk about a couple other reasons why I think this particular story is really instructive. And, one is that I think while it is true, tell me your name. Tracy. Well, I think it is absolutely true that there are many, many people who never, ever in their lives will have a negative confrontation with the police or contact, right? It wouldn't be a confrontation, it would just be contact, right? And really do see them as a resource. In the communities where I have worked and lived and, and advocated, that's never been the case, really. And so I think the people who I work with most frequently, this is the kind of context that they will find themselves in often, right? In deep need of help, without criminal legal support as a viable option for support, right? And probably as an antagonistic force, a relationship to it as an antagonistic force. And I mean that both explicitly and implicitly, right? So you can call a suicide hotline and they will say, if somebody has a gun and they're threatening themselves, you call the police, right? So the support that's set up, you can't access. And then if you already have a confrontational relationship, it's not an option, it's not on the table for you. What also helps us understand the intersection of individual, interpersonal, and state harm, which is often also at play, right? So as practitioners who work in anti-violence, we're very frequently put in the position of looking at an isolated individual incident or a history of an individual person, right? And the truth is, in my experience of doing this work, that there are frequently times when an individual is threatening harm to themselves, and they're doing that to harm somebody else in a relationship. And I'm not suggesting necessarily that was the case here, but I'm not suggesting it wasn't either. And the threat of state violence as well. And that could be anything from where I live in California, there's mandatory arrest laws for domestic violence disputes, right? So that could be somebody being removed from the household, that could be somebody being threatened by the police, that could be all manner of things. And I think frequently people find themselves at these intersections, right? I think it also broadens the sense of who we imagine when we imagine survivors of violence, right? So if I ask you to picture a survivor of violence, you probably get a very particular picture in your mind, right? And in this case, it's probably not this kind of guy, right? But he's a guy who experiences a range of different kinds of violence and harm. It expands the range of context that we normally think of when we consider harm happening. And it recognizes that in many situations, people surviving harm may also be engaging in harmful behavior. And that one is tricky to consider, right? And it doesn't mean that power is equal, and it doesn't mean that all harm is the same, but it helps us reflect on how complicated some of these situations can be. And then the final reason is that, Isaac asked creative interventions for support, so we were able to use our model in talking about the story. So,
I think you spoke really beautifully about what is happening in the United States. And I was just aware that for people from Australia, New Zealand and Canada, that we can easily think, oh, well, guns aren't an issue and, in prisons we're not like United States. Australia, Canada and New Zealand were cleared. They're Indigenous people using guns. We have a history of guns used very effectively, and the three countries have got a shocking history of the number of Indigenous people as the percentage in the prisons. And I sometimes think that when someone speaks about North America, we can somehow separate ourselves and think, oh no, that's not us. Oh, you poor thing. That's a really terrible thing. What do you do about it? And actually it's us too.
So for years, the prevailing common sense in the United States was to leverage the authority of law enforcement and the threat of imprisonment against people doing harm to each other, especially people perpetrating family, intimate, and sexual violence. And in fact, feminist movements in the United States campaigned long and hard and over a very arduous period of time to have rape, sexual assault, and other forms of intimate violence taken seriously enough to warrant state response, right? So no, it's not okay to beat your wife, right? That merits some kind of response in the kind of older frameworks that used to prevail, right? And over time, advocates, because of this really hard-fought battle to get attention and get appropriate response, found themselves more and more and more tightly bound to law enforcement and to imprisonment. And people who were fighting domestic violence and rape and sexual assault found that not only were kind of the remedies that they were involved in linked to law enforcement, but that their funding streams, for instance, were linked to cooperation with law enforcement, right? So who do you think was left out of that formula as that campaign was successful and the state responses started to come about? Have a guess. Who do you think was left out?
Refugee people, Aboriginal people, queer people,
Anybody else?
criminalized people, homeless people, people with mental illness.
The list goes on and on, right? Most of the communities that we work with, and I will name communities that just came up, right? Migrant and new immigrant communities, Black people, communities of color, Indigenous communities, queer, gender non-conforming communities, young people, political dissenters, right? All these people who don't have the option of police as their first remedy were left out of that equation, right? Many people have had a dramatically more negative experience than positive experience. That does not mean they do not call on the police. I want to make that clear. But it does mean that if people choose to do that, they might face different kinds of consequences than somebody else. And I think, as you heard in the clip, for some people, it is just obliterated as an option. It will not be considered. So if the prevailing responses to addressing harm rely on state intervention, which is often violent and harmful, if not more harmful than the initial violence itself, then what were people who were unwilling to engage law enforcement and the traditional social services that had become bound up with them? What were we meant to do, right? And so creative interventions approach to community accountability was one of those things that emerged. And the woman who developed creative interventions, Mimi Kim, was coming out of that context. She had worked for years and years in domestic violence work and shelter work and hotline work, and she just felt frustrated. She said, why is all that we have to offer people get out of the house, get a restraining order? Like, why are those the only remedies, especially when for a lot of people, as we heard Sean so eloquently describe this morning, it's not an option, or it's not the preferred option. So I want to talk just briefly about some of the values that guided the work. And they're meant to be a bit of a counter, right, to what had been at the time the prevailing logic. So creativity, right? So the standard responses aren't working. What else can we dream up? And can we take our dreaming seriously? And can we think expansively? collectivity and community responsibility. And this is a big one because violence isolates people, it's meant to alienate people, it's meant to make you feel like you're on your own, right? And so a community response is a lovely counterbalance to that. And it's also a way of demonstrating that we, all of us who are, and again, to reference Sean's presentation this morning, bystanders involved in the immediate situation, but who have an ethic of care for the people who we live and work and, play around, that we all have some responsibility for shifting the culture and shifting the conditions that allow violence to happen in the first place. Holism, and this was those of you who work in anti-violence probably and who are doing different kinds of things will probably have experienced push around this. And I know, I'm smiling at you, Kelly, because I know working with men in particular in these settings is challenging. But the idea is that we look at the whole situation, right? We look at the person or people who are surviving or enduring harm. We're looking at the people who are enacting harm on others. We understand that there might be harm happening in more directions than merely one. And we think about how everybody involved in the situation can be helped to shift their behavior, to heal, to transform the conditions that made the violence possible, and to promote health and well-being. And I mean that not in kind of a nurse eat your juice kind of situation, but I mean like lived well health, health and well-being, and I link that to self-determination, right? Here's another one that was a little dicey, but I think is at a cornerstone of our work: balancing safety and risk, right? Sometimes to ensure safety in the long term, you have to do some risky stuff up front. Right? Or sometimes to ensure stable health and safety, you need to do something that's maybe outside of the rules and regulations of what you would normally do, right? And I think we're so risk averse in dealing with violence, which is completely risky to begin with, right? It's like an oxymoron, right? That we're so risk averse that we wind up being so constricted and small in our thinking about what's possible, and we really limit people's options for them before they even have a chance to advocate for what they might want. Or we find ourselves, as we heard this morning, having to say, no, you shouldn't go back to your home, even if that's your preferred thing, or no, that's not the rule, right? And we understand, take very seriously the real harm that is done to people. So it's not to minimize that harm. It's not to act as if we all just hold hands, people are suddenly going to be healed and not hurt. But it is to say, along with creativity, that sometimes we need to push beyond our own comfort, and we need to take a leap of faith. And we need to be willing to fail, but to try again if we fail. Accountability. So the traditional sense is if somebody does harm, you banish them, you shame them, you push them out of the community, you lock them in a cage, you make them physically far away. And we have found that you can hold people accountable much more effectively if you hold them close to you. That way you can see what they're doing, and they can see that you can see what they're doing, right? And they have people to be accountable to. Whereas if they are sitting in a cage, their ability to shift their behavior, their ability to take responsibility and to be accountable is severely curtailed because it's not a setting that's set up for that. It's a setting that's set up for isolation, dehumanization, and genocide, right? Transformation. So the idea, again, is we would like the individual situation to improve. We want people to be out of harm's way. We don't want anybody to be suffering under sustained violence. And we also want to think about the conditions in the long term that make violence possible. So it's not simply about an individual situation. It's about what are we doing incrementally over time and in expanding out ways to transform conditions. That means challenging patriarchy. That means challenging heteronormativity. That means challenging white supremacy. That means challenging colonialism and imperialism, right? So I know that sounds big, and for people who don't do organizing work, it's like, well, I just want to counsel this person, right? And I understand that, but I think, this approach, there's a role for that, right? And getting people in good fighting form to be able to take a next step is really crucial work. So it's not to minimize that, but my responsibility is then to figure out how to put all of these individual things together so that we're pushing against these things so we don't have to continue doing individual counseling. Does that make sense? Flexibility, very similar to creativity. If we mess something up, we don't keep doing it. We have to change the model. If it doesn't work, we have to not be dedicated to the precious thing we created. We have to be able to be flexible and to admit failure. Patience. And this one is very hard, particularly if you are surviving sustained violence, right? But change takes a lot of time. So we also want remedies that are going to happen immediately and guarantees about things that are going to be great and fixed, right? So when we talk to people about our model, there's like, okay, well, tell me what to do, right? Every single situation is going to be remarkably different based on the conditions, based on the players, based on the histories, right? But change also takes a lot of time, right? So if I say, Phoebe, you hurt me, I don't want you to hurt me anymore, stop hurting me, Phoebe's going to have to take some time to figure out how to shift her behavior. That's not going to happen just because I call Phoebe out. And she'll probably need support to do that, and it'll probably take time. That does not mean that everything is everything, and if Phoebe keeps messing up and doesn't take any steps toward accountability, that's okay. But it means she has to have a little bit of time to meet some of the goals that we set in terms of transformation of behavior. Sorry, I won't keep using you as an example. Building on what we know, we've heard a lot about this today. We heard this a bit from Justin yesterday about kind of decolonizing knowledge and really honoring the knowledge that we all bring. We know a lot, and I think one of the things that we've found from the stop stories is that we know a lot and we're doing a lot already. And we get talked out of our own common sense frequently. So we get told that what we know is not good professional knowledge, or is not legitimate knowledge, or is dangerous knowledge, right? And we know what keeps us safe, we know what makes us healthy, and it needs to be honored. Sustainability, even if we manage to get something stabilized, if it tips back after we walk away, then we haven't done good work here, right? And again, that takes patience because it takes repetition. And then the last one is regeneration. And that's a word that Mimi uses instead of replicability. Somebody else has to be able to do it, right? And she didn't like replication because she's like, that sounds like a Ford factory or something, right? But regeneration is that somebody else should be able to take the ideas, nurture them, grow them, use them. And creative interventions and storytelling and organizing project were set up on a planned obsolescence model, right? So the idea was we don't want to create another social service. If what we're saying is that we don't want people to only have to rely on social services, and not that social services are bad, but we want people to have a variety of opportunities, then if we make a situation in which they feel like they have to come to us to facilitate the process, we're replicating a thing that we don't want to replicate, right? So we shut the organizations down after 5 years, and I think we've had some discussion about whether or not that was premature, but that's what we did. And all of these resources now live on the web. And Mimi and I are available to talk to people about the model, and Mimi continues to train people in the model. And so they live, but in a different way, and in a way that doesn't require the sustainability of an institution, but continues to force out the knowledge into the communities and say, take this up, learn this, use this, evolve it in ways that are going to be the most useful for you. Creative interventions also emerged from Mimi's work in Insight Women of Color Against Violence. They may have heard of that organization. So that's a US-based organization made up of women of color and indigenous women. And the ethic there really was that they were very strong, feminist women and gender nonconforming people who were intolerant of the scale, the level, the breadth of interpersonal violence happening in our communities, And they were also completely intolerant of the levels of state violence that our people were facing. So they started an organization that was really dedicated to that intersection. And some of you in your reading may have seen the Insight Critical Resistance Statement Against Violence. And we did that as a way of acknowledging that there was this kind of missing intersection between people who had been working on imprisonment and policing and state violence and people who had been working primarily in the sector of interpersonal harm, right? So, we would say on the policing side and prison side, it's like, you don't take seriously enough, like that state violence is incredibly harmful and has these lasting impacts. And then the anti-violence people would say on the other side, well, you don't take seriously that harm is happening in our communities and we need to stop it, right? So it was a meeting of the minds to say, well, we actually have these very shared values, and how can we push our circles closer together so that they overlap and that we're fighting both and we're intolerant of both scales of violence. So critical resistance, it came into working with creative interventions. I think through Insight, we all kind of had relationships to Insight in that way, and this commitment to the intolerance of both of these scales of violence. And I think part of what we were able to bring was this analysis around the prison industrial complex, an analysis around the level of harm, the history of harm, of imprisonment, policing, sentencing, and surveillance, particularly in communities of color. But we were also able to bring concrete strategies because the organization had been organizing against imprisonment, policing, surveillance, and sentencing. And so when there were questions about, well, how, if you're not going to call the police, how, what, right? We were able to actually start having those conversations and make them a little less theoretical. And at the beginning, they were more theoretical. And as we learn and practice, they become less. So while we were able to offer that analysis, I think we also, as I was saying, had these concrete strategies, and then in addition, an organizing orientation to our work. And if we look back at the values here, we can see some of the organizing principles that organizations use that are among CI's values, creative interventions values. And you can see the influence of working with organizers on this model. So I think collective and community responsibility, which was an ethic, but I think got really crystallized and filled out in different ways by working with organizers. Safety and risk-taking, I think when you're campaigning, escalation is one of the things that a lot of campaigners do, and trying to figure out how to escalate infighting violence, right, without increasing harm anywhere is something that we've had to deal with. I think transformation and sustainability as well. We want to transform the conditions, and that's a very different orientation than lots of anti-violence organizations take. Conversely, the anti-violence sector, I think, really helped those of us working against imprisonment and policing to take people's concerns about interpersonal violence more seriously and to consider those concerns more fully in all of our work. And the collaboration between anti-prison and policing movements and the radical anti-violence movement, rather, I think has really begun to shift how people imagine they can respond to harm. And we've seen since that time groups and organizations emerge that are working directly at that intersection. And I think that's a really affirmative, a really positive shift. And being confronted again and again with the crushing violence of imprisonment and policing. And I want to say this very explicitly because I think a lot of what's coming out of the United States right now are images of police killings, which are obviously completely crushing and devastating. But I'm also talking about the all-day, everyday grinding violence of policing. That is constant surveillance. That is stop and search. That is harassment, verbal and physical harassment. That are psychological and physical beatings that people are experiencing all day, every day. And that really is, I think, at the core of the violence of policing. So as extreme as the numbers of people killed by law enforcement are in the United States, and they are extreme, that's still a very small percentage of the survivors of the violence of policing, right? That's much, much more pervasive. So, sorry, it's a little hobby horse. So, anyway, back to where I was. After years of seeing that, I began to understand that the surest way to reduce the violence of policing is to reduce contact with policing, right? Stands to reason. You reduce contact with the thing that's causing you the most harm, you should be able to reduce the violent impacts of it. So I began to think about different ways that we could reduce the role that policing had in people's lives that I worked with, and hopefully to make it obsolete eventually. And so the idea that I had was, what are some of the different ways that we could make policing an option of last resort rather than a first response? And how could we shift our idea about who we want to be the first responders in our communities? And so I've been taking up work recently toward that end, doing some pilot projects. And I've been asking the groups that I've been working with, one is an organization and another is a cluster of neighbors, to think about the circumstances under which they thought they might contact law enforcement. And then I asked them to think about what they thought they might need to not call law enforcement. And I also did some review of information about the nature of calls to emergency services in my town. What do you think they mostly were for? Why do you think people are calling the police in Oakland? Domestic violence. What else? Burglary. Any other ideas? Homelessness. Yeah. The number one is disturbance, which is loud noise, somebody fighting, I don't like who's in front of my house, that kind of stuff, right? There were a lot of like loitering, suspicious people, right? And the number of very serious things is dramatically lower. And I think there are all kind of complicated reasons for that, but that we can talk about later. But so the idea was probably we don't need to imagine how to respond to a serial killer first thing. Probably what we need to figure out how to respond to is, I don't like what my neighbors are doing, right? And we can do that, right? And people are calling law enforcement. They don't go next door, knock on the door, say, will you please turn down your music or whatever, will you please lower your voices, right? And I'm not trying to be flip about it because I think there are circumstances under which people wouldn't feel safe doing that. But again, if you imagine that you operate collectively and you're not ever really going anywhere on your own to do this kind of work, you can be emboldened by having people with you who are like, we'd prefer not to call the cops, and we'd also wonder if you'd be willing to turn down your music, right? So these are the kinds of situations, or I don't like the person who's hanging out in front of my house, or I feel nervous walking home from public transportation at night alone, like very, very real common concerns, but things that certainly we could deal with without having to rely on maximum force as a remedy. So people started brainstorming all different kinds of things that they thought that they could do. And we began with situations of low danger, low lethality. And the reason for that is that we wanted to build a practice. We wanted to develop a habit. We wanted to build confidence. We wanted to expand the range of skills and tools that we had available to us. And then we wanted to think about how to leverage what we had learned incrementally to deal with more and more serious situations over time, right? So my approach is not like, okay, never under any circumstances again, if you're used to calling the cops, stop doing that. But it's like, what step could you take to reduce the cops as the center of gravity for your responses? And who else can you involve? And what other resources could you bring to bear? And we were able to develop really basic things. So sometimes when I say these, I'm like, these don't sound like anything. And the truth is that they're really commonsensical. We developed crisis plans. We developed asset mapping templates. We developed neighborhood directories, policies to respond to harm within organizations, community self-defense strategies, and other kinds of tools. And we did those when we were not in crisis. And I think that's really key. Our thinking gets very constricted, completely understandably, when we're in crisis, and we have very limited sense of what our options are. And when we're not in crisis, we can be more creative. We can imagine taking risks that we absolutely cannot imagine when we're under greater pressure. And so I think the idea is not to constantly be like, I'm about to be in crisis, let me plan for crisis, right? But is to shift an orientation to living, that is, how do I stay connected? What resources do I need to generate around me so that I always have more options available, right? So I know that my neighbor speaks Spanish, and should I have an issue there, I can do that. I know that my neighbor down the way does childcare, and if I have an issue that I need to leave the house, I have somewhere to take my kids. And we've had a conversation so that I know that that person is willing to take my kids. And this is an example I use all the time, and it's you memorize 3 phone numbers, right? Not on your phone, but in your head. Memorize 3 phone numbers of people who you could call if there were an emergency. And think about what you might need. Do you need somewhere to go? Would you need a bed or a safe place to go? Would you need somebody who had access to transportation? Would you need somebody who knew you really well and who you felt comfortable with, right? And that's a very basic thing, but everybody could do that, and that could kick in when you have moments of crisis in a different way. It's about shifting our common sense about first response. And again, it's incremental. So I'm not trying to sell you on something right now. I'm just saying this is the approach that I've been using and we've seen be pretty effective in terms of shifting people's common sense about what they have access to. But I want to return to a couple key principles guiding the work because I think they also resonate with narrative practice fairly well. And one is community action. So working individually can take us forward. Working collectively can advance that work even more. And I think we always do better together than we do alone. Creativity, and I think we need to think very expansively and creatively about what's possible. I think we're ruled a lot by fear, and we're fed fear a lot. Fear of each other, fear of what we don't know. And I think imagining with creativity and operating from plenty rather than from a place of scarcity just puts us in a different position to imagine what's possible. Safety and risk-taking again. Innovation sometimes requires taking some risks. And then transformation. So even as we're aiming to address immediate conditions that help people be in their best fighting form, and this is crucial, right? So the work that people do to keep people healthy and well and engaged is crucial. We need to be in our best fighting form. But, excuse me, but I hope that we can also always have ways to have our eyes on the broader horizon, right? So that we're not satisfied with settling one person's situation. We're not satisfied with one person's safety, but we're really concerned with transforming the conditions that potentially could make us all safer and more well.